Hey guys, tonight we're taking a deep dive into the toga-clad, sandal-wearing world of the ancient Greek philosophers. Forget the serene marble statues, the profound wisdom, and the lofty debates you might have in your head from textbooks. We're going to peel back the layers of intellectual grandeur and reveal how ancient Greek philosophers really lived. It sucked. Imagine yourself strolling through the Athenian agora, not as a respected sage, but as someone who actually was one of these supposedly enlightened thinkers. Sounds like a noble pursuit. Right, ancient Greek philosophy was indeed groundbreaking. But here's the cheeky reality check: if you were an ancient Greek philosopher, you probably won't survive this, at least, not without constant discomfort. Public mockery, or wishing you had a nice, soft chair and a hot shower. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your first shock upon immersing yourself in the life of an ancient Greek philosopher wouldn't be the intellectual rigor, but the profound absence of what we consider basic amenities, leading directly to lack of modern comforts, basic living. No luxuries. Forget plush armchairs, climate control, or even a decent mattress. Their lives were defined by stark simplicity, often by choice, but more often by necessity. Imagine waking up in a typical Athenian home, which, even for the relatively well-off, was a far cry from modern living. You wouldn't have multiple rooms dedicated to various functions. Spaces were often multi-purpose, small and Spartan. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a simple wooden bed frame with a straw or wool mattress, a few stools, and a small table. There were no wardrobes bursting with clothes, just a few simple tunics and cloaks. This was a basic living existence, designed for function over form. It's like living in a permanent, somewhat dusty, minimalistic Airbnb that also doubles as your philosophy lecture hall. The concept of luxuries, as we understand them, simply didn't exist for most people, including many philosophers who often deliberately eschewed material possessions. There were no luxuries like indoor plumbing, central heating, or air conditioning. Imagine trying to read a scroll in a room that's either stiflingly hot in summer or bone-chillingly cold in winter. With only an oil lamp for light after dark, your personal space would be cramped, and privacy, as we'll discuss later, almost non-existent. Food preparation was basic, often done over an open fire or a small brazier. Water had to be drawn from a well or public fountain. There were no soft fabrics, only coarse wool and linen. Even the sandals you'd wear would be simple leather straps, offering little in the way of cushioning or support for those long walks to the agora. Imagine walking miles on hard, uneven ancient roads, your feet constantly protesting. This deliberate or forced simplicity meant that philosophers, even the renowned ones, spent much of their energy simply managing the practicalities of a physically demanding life. Their focus on the intellectual wasn't because their material needs were easily met. It was often in spite of their material discomforts. They were accustomed to a level of austerity that would make most modern minimalist enthusiasts blanch. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this lack of comfort is the archaeological evidence of typical ancient Greek homes oikos, which reveals small, simple mud brick or stone structures with few furnishings, indicating a generally Spartan domestic life even for citizens. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that Diogenes the Cynic famously lived in a large ceramic jar or tub pythos in the marketplace, deliberately rejecting all conventional comforts to emphasize his philosophical commitment to self-sufficiency and simplicity. Imagine trying to conduct philosophical debates from inside a giant flower pot. It's certainly one way to get people to listen, if only out of sheer confusion. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of material comforts in ancient Greek society primarily fostered a greater emphasis on intellectual pursuits and civic virtue. By stripping away distractions, or if it simply made daily life incredibly difficult and contributed to widespread discomfort. Limiting accessibility to leisure and learning for many, did it make them wiser or just grumpier regardless? Your first step into the life of an ancient Greek philosopher would be a jarring encounter with the lack of modern comforts, forcing you into a basic living existence with absolutely no luxuries to ease your thoughtful burdens. So, your first step into the life of an ancient Greek philosopher would be a jarring encounter with the lack of modern comforts, forcing you into a basic living existence with absolutely no luxuries to ease your thoughtful burdens. But even more striking than the sparse furnishings would be the constant, unavoidable assault on your senses, leading directly to limited hygiene, infrequent bathing, constant odors. Forget scented soaps and daily showers, ancient Greek life, even for the most brilliant minds, was a pungent symphony of natural aromas, making personal cleanliness a battle rarely won. Imagine yourself on a warm Athenian day, engaged in a lively philosophical debate in the agora. The air, far from fresh, would be thick with a blend of human and animal scents. The concept of daily bathing as we know it simply didn't exist for most ordinary citizens, including philosophers. Infrequent bathing was the norm. Baths, when taken, were often communal and infrequent, maybe once a week if you were lucky, in public bathhouses or at home with a basin of cold water. Imagine going days, even weeks, without a proper wash, and then engaging in close proximity discussions with dozens of other similarly unwashed individuals. It's like being trapped in a very crowded, very intellectual locker room that hasn't seen a cleaning crew in months. Personal hygiene was rudimentary. There was no widespread use of soap instead. People would use olive oil to cleanse their skin, scraping it off with a strigil, a curved metal tool along with dirt and sweat. Imagine trying to get truly clean with just oil and a scraper. Dental hygiene was practically non-existent, leading to rampant tooth decay and bad breath, and deodorant a concept utterly alien to the ancient world. This meant a reality of constant odors. The smell of unwashed bodies would be ever present. Add to this the pervasive scent of sweat, especially during the hot Greek summers. Clothes, made of wool or linen, would absorb these odors and were not washed frequently either. Imagine trying to concentrate on the fundamental nature of reality while being constantly assailed by the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies. Stale clothes, and perhaps a faint whiff of whatever philosophical colleague had for breakfast. It's enough to make you long for a simple stick of Old Spice, or even just a strong breeze, beyond personal smells. The environment itself contributed. Animal waste from horses, donkeys, and other livestock would be common in the streets. Open drains and poor waste disposal, we'll get to that later. Trust me, added to the general olfactory experience. So, your intellectual pursuits would be undertaken amidst a symphony of scents that would send a modern nose into shock. This lack of emphasis on what we consider basic cleanliness highlights a fundamental difference in ancient and modern sensibilities, and certainly added a layer of physical discomfort to the philosopher's already challenging life. One mainstream historical fact that supports this limited hygiene is the widespread evidence of communal public bathhouses like the Roman baths. But Greek equivalents existed, though less elaborate, used for social gatherings and occasional bathing, indicating that private, daily bathing was not a standard practice in ancient Greece. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some cynic philosophers, like Diogenes, reportedly embraced filth and deliberately neglected their hygiene as a way of rejecting societal conventions and demonstrating their commitment to natural living, essentially weaponizing body odor as a philosophical statement. Imagine trying to argue with a guy who smells like he just wrestled a goat and then rolled in a compost heap. It certainly gave them an edge in debates, if only by clearing the immediate vicinity. Historians still argue whether the limited hygiene practices in ancient Greece primarily contributed to higher rates of skin diseases and general discomfort, or if ancient populations developed a greater physiological tolerance to such conditions. making the experience less impactful than modern interpretations suggest. Did it make them sick? Or just smell bad? Regardless, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher would be an olfactory challenge, defined by limited hygiene, infrequent bathing, and a pervasive reality of constant odors that would make deep contemplation a truly pungent experience. So, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher would be an olfactory challenge, defined by limited hygiene, infrequent bathing, and a pervasive reality of constant odors that would make deep contemplation a truly pungent experience. But while your nose was suffering, your stomach would likely be experiencing its own form of deprivation, leading to dietary monotony, simple foods, seasonal scarcity, forget gourmet meals, and endless culinary variety. The philosopher's plate was often filled with basic, repetitive fare, and finding enough to eat could become a constant concern, particularly outside of the harvest seasons. Imagine sitting down for a meal after a long day of philosophical discourse. Your plate wouldn't be piled high with succulent meats or exotic fruits. Instead, the typical ancient Greek diet, even for citizens, was primarily based on what was known as the Mediterranean triad grain: olives and olive oil, and grapes and wine. This meant your meals would be characterized by dietary monotony. Imagine eating variations of barley bread, olive oil, and diluted wine for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day after day, week after week. It's like living on a permanent, very bland, vegan diet before veganism was cool. Your meals would consist of simple foods. You'd likely eat barley cakes like a thick, unleavened bread, pulses, lentils, chickpeas, beans, some vegetables if they were in season onions, garlic, cabbage, and perhaps some cheese from goat or sheep milk. Meat was a luxury, typically reserved for religious festivals and sacrifices, or for the very wealthy. Fish, if you live near the coast, might be more common but still basic. Imagine trying to find inspiration for a new theory of ethics while chewing on another piece of dry, hard bread and a handful of olives. Your taste buds would definitely not be expanding their horizons. Then came the issue of seasonal scarcity. Ancient agriculture was entirely dependent on the rhythms of nature. Fresh fruits and vegetables were only available for short periods during their growing seasons. During the long winter months, fresh produce would be almost non-existent. Your diet would shift even more heavily towards dried grains, pulses, and preserved foods. Imagine the dread as the days grew shorter, knowing that your food options, already limited, were about to become even more restricted until spring. It's enough to make you crave a simple tomato in January. Philosophers, often choosing lives of austerity or simply being too engrossed in thought to care much about food, were unlikely to fare better than the average citizen, and sometimes worse if they rejected conventional means of income. This lack of diverse nutrition, while perhaps sufficient for survival, certainly didn't contribute to robust health or culinary delight. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this dietary monotony is the archaeological evidence from ancient Greek middens and historical texts like comedies that satirize food scarcity, which consistently reveal a diet heavily reliant on grains, legumes, and olives, with meat being a rare commodity, confirming the basic nature of their meals. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers, notably the Pythagoreans, adopted strict vegetarian diets for philosophical and spiritual reasons, further limiting their food options in an already restricted culinary landscape. Imagine adopting an even more restrictive diet in an era when food was already incredibly monotonous. Just to prove a point, it's certainly a dedicated approach to both philosophy and fasting. Historians still argue whether the simple and often monotonous ancient Greek diet primarily contributed to a leaner, healthier populace free from the diseases of affluence, or if it led to widespread nutrient deficiencies and susceptibility to various ailments due to a lack of dietary diversity. Did it make them robust, or just hungry regardless? Your plate as an ancient Greek philosopher would be a testament to dietary monotony, filled with simple foods, and perpetually subjected to the relentless reality of seasonal scarcity, making every meal a utilitarian necessity rather than a pleasurable experience. So, your plate as an ancient Greek philosopher would be a testament to dietary monotony, filled with simple foods, and perpetually subjected to the relentless reality of seasonal scarcity. But even beyond the bland meals, your philosophical pursuits would often be conducted not in cozy studies, but directly in the elements, leading to constant outdoor exposure weather. Elements, lack of shelter. Forget climate-controlled lecture halls or comfortable offices. Ancient Greek philosophers spent much of their time enduring the whims of nature, making their intellectual journey a surprisingly physical one. Imagine spending your day debating profound ideas. You wouldn't be doing it indoors. Sheltered from the world, instead, you'd likely be in the agora, the public marketplace, or strolling through a stoa-covered walkway, or perhaps walking through olive groves with your students. This meant constant outdoor exposure. You were at the mercy of the Greek weather, which could be beautiful, but also intensely hot, surprisingly cold, or suddenly wet. It's like having every single one of your classes held permanently outside, rain or shine, and your professor keeps yelling about the forms. The weather would be a persistent factor in your daily life. During the hot summers, you'd contend with blistering sun, sweat, and dust, with little more than a thin tunic and the occasional shade of a tree for relief. Imagine trying to concentrate on complex logical arguments while sweat is trickling down your brow and the sun is beating relentlessly down on your head. In winter, even in Greece, temperatures could drop, and you'd face chilly winds and occasional rain. With only a simple wool cloak to keep you warm, your philosophy might be warm, but your body often wouldn't be. You would be constantly battling the elements. Dust from unpaved roads and the bustling marketplace would settle on everything, including you. The glare of the sun could be intense, and sudden downpours could leave you drenched. There were no insulated buildings, no double-glazed windows, and certainly no heating systems to provide a comfortable refuge. Imagine trying to explain the concept of logos while a sudden gust of wind whips your toga around your legs and throws dust in your eyes. This lifestyle was also marked by a general lack of shelter that we take for granted today. Public spaces, where much philosophical discourse took place, were open, even a stoa, while providing a roof. Was open on the sides, offering limited protection from cold winds or driving rain. Your home, as we discussed, was basic and offered only minimal comfort. You couldn't just retreat to a climate-controlled room when the weather turned unpleasant. This constant negotiation with the natural environment meant that ancient Greek philosophers had a deep, visceral connection to the world around them, but it also added a layer of physical discomfort and endurance to their intellectual pursuits. Their minds might soar, but their bodies were firmly grounded in the raw reality of the natural world. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this constant outdoor exposure is the architectural design of prominent philosophical schools and meeting places, such as the Stoa Poikile painted porch where the Stoics taught, or Plato's Academy and Aristotle's Lyceum, which were open groves or gymnasia. Confirming that teaching and discussion predominantly occurred in open or semi-open public spaces. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers, particularly the Cynics, would deliberately choose to endure extreme weather conditions, like standing naked in snow as a form of ascetic practice to harden their bodies and minds against physical discomfort. Making a philosophical statement out of misery. Imagine your professor delivering a lecture while shivering uncontrollably. Just to prove a point about resilience, it's certainly a dedicated, if somewhat masochistic, teaching method. Historians still argue whether this constant outdoor exposure primarily fostered a unique connection to nature and a robust physical constitution, contributing to their intellectual stamina, or if it simply made ancient Greek life unnecessarily harsh and uncomfortable. hindering deeper scholarly work that might benefit from more controlled environments? Did it make them resilient, or just miserable regardless? Your philosophical journey as an ancient Greek would be intimately intertwined with constant outdoor exposure, forcing you to contend with the relentless weather and elements, and perpetually highlighting your fundamental lack of shelter. So, your philosophical journey as an ancient Greek would be intimately intertwined with constant outdoor exposure, forcing you to contend with the relentless weather and elements, and perpetually highlighting your fundamental lack of shelter. But even more challenging than the physical discomforts was the relentless pressure of living a life in the public eye, leading to social scrutiny, public debates, constant judgment. Forget quiet contemplation in a private study. The ancient Greek philosopher's life was often a performance. Every idea, every action, subject to the intense and often harsh gaze of their fellow citizens. Imagine trying to develop a groundbreaking theory about the cosmos. You wouldn't be doing it in isolation, surrounded by stacks of books which barely existed anyway. Instead, your intellectual life unfolded largely in public spaces. The agora, the gymnasium, the stoa. These were your lecture halls and your debate stages. This meant you were under intense social scrutiny almost constantly. Every word you spoke, every argument you made, was fair game for public discussion, agreement, or furious rejection. It's like having every single one of your academic papers instantly published to social media for unfiltered public commentary. And most of it isn't nice. Your primary method of philosophical exchange was through public debates. Socrates famously engaged citizens in dialectic in the marketplace, challenging their assumptions. Other philosophers would present their ideas to an audience, inviting questions and counterarguments. This fostered intellectual rigor, but it also meant you were constantly exposing your thoughts to immediate, unfiltered criticism. Imagine trying to articulate a complex philosophical concept while a heckler in the crowd loudly proclaims your ideas are nonsense. Or a rival philosopher tries to trip you up with a clever rhetorical trap. It's certainly a lively way to learn, but also incredibly vulnerable. This exposure naturally led to constant judgment. Your appearance, your mannerisms, your choice of words, your personal life all could be dissected and critiqued by the public. Were you too arrogant, too humble, too verbose, not eloquent enough, your reputation, and thus your ability to attract students and influence thought, depended heavily on how you were perceived. Imagine your entire career hanging on the fickle opinions of a crowd who might just be bored and looking for entertainment. It's enough to make you wish for the quiet, anonymous life of a modern-day academic with tenure. The public nature of their lives meant that philosophers often became figures of public fascination, sometimes reverence, but just as often, mockery. Comedians would satirize them in plays, portraying them as eccentric, impractical, or even dangerous. This constant exposure to public opinion, both positive and negative, required thick skin and a strong sense of conviction. This pervasive social scrutiny, while fostering vibrant intellectual life, also made the philosopher's existence incredibly demanding, forcing them to always be on stage and ready to defend their ideas and their character. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this social scrutiny is the trial and condemnation of Socrates in Athens, where he was publicly accused of impiety and corrupting the youth, ultimately leading to his execution. Demonstrating the very real dangers of public philosophical inquiry and dissent. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers, like Diogenes the Cynic again, would deliberately perform outrageous public acts, such as publicly masturbating, or loudly denouncing passersby, specifically to provoke a reaction and challenge societal norms, essentially trolling the entire Athenian public as a philosophical exercise. Imagine the local eccentric at the park making grand, philosophical statements while doing something truly bizarre. Just to make a point, it's certainly a memorable way to get your message across, if not always a pleasant one for onlookers. Historians still argue whether the constant social scrutiny faced by ancient Greek philosophers primarily sharpened their arguments and forced greater clarity in their thought, leading to intellectual excellence, or if it often stifled genuine originality and encouraged conformity. By making them fearful of public condemnation, did it refine their ideas, or just limit them regardless? Your intellectual journey as an ancient Greek philosopher would be inextricably linked to intense social scrutiny, forcing you into endless public debates and subjecting you to the often unforgiving crucible of constant judgment from your fellow citizens. So, your intellectual journey as an ancient Greek philosopher would be inextricably linked to intense social scrutiny, forcing you into endless public debates and subjecting you to the often unforgiving crucible of constant judgment from your fellow citizens. But even if you bravely weathered public opinion, a different kind of anxiety would often gnaw at the back of your mind, a far more mundane, yet deeply impactful. Concerned financial precarity, poverty, patronage dependence, scrounging. Forget ivory towers and trust funds. Many ancient Greek philosophers lived on the edge of destitution. Their intellectual pursuits often at odds with the harsh realities of earning a living. Imagine dedicating your life to the pursuit of wisdom, to understanding the nature of reality, or to teaching the youth. Now imagine doing it while constantly worrying about where your next meal is coming from. For many ancient Greek philosophers, financial precarity was a pervasive reality, unlike modern professors with salaried positions. There was no guaranteed income for philosophical inquiry or teaching. It's like being a full-time content creator on a platform that doesn't pay. And your content is just really complicated thoughts. Some philosophers, like Socrates, famously rejected payment for their teaching, believing that wisdom should be freely shared. This commitment to principle often meant embracing poverty. Socrates, for example, lived a notoriously simple life, often going without shoes or a proper cloak. Imagine trying to gain followers and intellectual respect while looking perpetually disheveled and possibly a bit hungry. It's certainly a unique brand image, if not a very comfortable one. Other philosophers, especially those who taught rhetoric or specific skills, might earn money, but it was often inconsistent. Many relied on patronage dependence. Wealthy individuals, curious aristocrats, or aspiring politicians might offer financial support or hospitality in exchange for philosophical guidance or simply the prestige of having a philosopher associated with their household. Imagine having to subtly or not so subtly butter up a wealthy patron, knowing that your next meal or rent payment depended on their continued goodwill. It's less about pure intellectual pursuit and more about navigating complex social dynamics for survival. This often led to scrounging for basic necessities. Philosophers might depend on gifts from appreciative students, invitations to symposia, drinking parties that often involved intellectual discussion and food, or simply living off the bare minimum. Diogenes the Cynic, again, is the extreme example. Living in a jar and openly begging, imagine having to rely on the charity of others, or constantly seeking out opportunities for a free meal, just to continue your philosophical work. It's enough to make you consider a career in something slightly more lucrative, like pottery or fishmongering. The tension between their lofty intellectual ideals and the harsh economic realities of their daily lives was a constant challenge for many philosophers, shaping not only their living conditions but also, arguably, aspects of their philosophies. One mainstream historical fact that supports this financial precarity is the accounts from contemporary biographers and students, e.g., Xenophon and Plato on Socrates, which frequently describe philosophers living simply, eschewing wealth, and often relying on gifts or basic means for subsistence rather than formal income. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers were reportedly so poor that they would share cloaks with their students in cold weather, taking turns wearing the only warm garment they collectively owned during outdoor lectures. Imagine your professor asking if he could borrow your jacket because it's chilly outside and he doesn't have one. It certainly builds camaraderie, if not comfort. Historians still argue whether the financial precarity of ancient Greek philosophers primarily fostered intellectual independence by freeing them from conventional societal pressures, or if it limited their reach and forced them into compromised positions of dependence, ultimately hindering the wider dissemination of their ideas. Did it make them purer thinkers, or just less comfortable regardless? Your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was often a tightrope walk over the abyss of financial precarity, forcing you into poverty, relying on patronage dependence, and often resorting to desperate scrounging just to keep your body fed while your mind soared. So, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was often a tightrope walk over the abyss of financial precarity, forcing you into poverty, relying on patronage dependence, and often resorting to desperate scrounging just to keep your body fed while your mind soared. But even if you somehow managed to scrape by economically, your physical existence would still be marked by a persistent, often grating reality, physical discomfort, hard seating, manual labor, few amenities. Forget ergonomic chairs and climate control. Ancient Greek life, even for the learned, involved a significant amount of bodily strain and a general lack of anything truly comfortable. Imagine settling down for a philosophical discussion. You wouldn't be sinking into a plush sofa. Instead, you'd likely be sitting on a hard wooden bench, a stone step, or perhaps even the bare ground. Hard seating was the norm. Extended periods of sitting on unyielding surfaces could lead to aches, stiffness, and discomfort. Imagine trying to concentrate on Plato's theory of forms while your backside is numb and your back is protesting. It's like attending a really long lecture in an auditorium designed by someone who hates spines, beyond just sitting. Daily life often involved a degree of manual labor. While philosophers weren't typically farmers, they would still engage in activities that required physical effort. Walking for miles each day was standard, often on uneven terrain. Carrying scrolls, fetching water, or even assisting with household chores if they lived in a modest home would be part of their routine. There were no elevators, no cars, and certainly no delivery services for every need. Imagine having to lug heavy water jars up a hill after a tiring intellectual debate. Your body would certainly feel the strain, making you appreciate the simple convenience of a modern faucet. And across the board, there were few amenities designed purely for comfort or ease. We've already touched on the lack of modern hygiene and heating. Add to that the absence of soft bedding, a straw or thin wool mattress was common. Effective lighting after dark oil lamps were dim and smoky, and any form of climate control? Drafty homes in winter, stifling heat in summer. Hard surfaces everywhere. Comfort was simply not a priority in ancient Greek design or lifestyle for the majority. Imagine trying to write down your profound thoughts while shivering in a drafty room, your fingers stiff from the cold. This constant physical discomfort served as a grounding, often irritating, reminder of the raw reality of ancient life. While it might have, arguably, helped them focus on the abstract and the spiritual by making the material world less appealing, it certainly didn't make their daily existence a pleasant one. Their bodies were constantly reminded of their physical limitations, even as their minds sought to transcend them. One mainstream historical fact that supports this physical discomfort is the design of public spaces like the agora and gymnasia, which featured hard stone benches and open-air environments, indicating that physical comfort was secondary to functionality and public interaction. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Stoic philosophers, in their pursuit of apatheia, freedom from disturbance, would deliberately expose themselves to physical discomforts, such as wearing thin cloaks in winter or walking barefoot on rough terrain, as a form of training to harden their resolve and detach themselves from bodily sensations. Imagine your philosophy teacher showing up to class in a t-shirt and shorts during a blizzard, just to make a point about endurance. It's certainly a hands-on approach to uncomfortable learning. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of physical discomfort in ancient Greece primarily fostered a more robust and resilient populace, capable of enduring hardship, or if it simply contributed to a lower quality of life, greater suffering, and potentially limited the intellectual output of those constantly battling their physical environment. Did it build character, or just pain regardless? Your life as an ancient Greek philosopher would be a constant negotiation with physical discomfort, from hard seating to demanding manual labor, with precious few amenities to soften the edges of a rigorous intellectual existence. So, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher would be a constant negotiation with physical discomfort, from hard seating to demanding manual labor, with precious few amenities to soften the edges of a rigorous intellectual existence. But while aches and pains were a daily reality, a far more terrifying threat constantly loomed over your well-being: limited medical care, primitive treatments, high mortality. Forget modern hospitals and advanced diagnostics. Ancient Greek medicine, for all its innovations, was rudimentary by today's standards, making even common ailments a potential death sentence. Imagine falling ill in ancient Greece. Perhaps you've caught a persistent fever, sustained a nasty wound from a fall, or developed a mysterious internal ailment. Your first recourse wouldn't be a sterile clinic, but likely a local healer. Perhaps someone knowledgeable in herbal remedies, or a practitioner of what was then considered advanced medicine, often influenced by Hippocratic principles. However, even these, which were groundbreaking for their time, were based on theories like the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, believing that illness was caused by an imbalance in these bodily fluids. It's like trying to fix a complex engine problem by just looking at the color of its fluids and maybe tapping it a few times. The primitive treatments you'd receive would be a mix of the practical and the outright dangerous. Bloodletting, cutting a vein to let out bad blood, was a common remedy for almost everything, often performed indiscriminately. Purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea, and cupping were also standard practices, all designed to rebalance those humors. Imagine feeling weak and unwell, and then a healer decides the best cure is to make you even weaker by draining some of your blood. It's enough to make you just prefer the illness for injuries. Things were equally grim. Without any understanding of germ theory, wounds were rarely cleaned properly. Poultices made of various herbs or natural substances might be applied, often introducing more infection than they prevented. Bone setting was crude, and amputations, when performed, were excruciatingly painful. Done without anesthesia and frequently resulted in fatal shock or rampant infection. Imagine screaming in agony as a limb is crudely removed, knowing that your chances of survival are slim even if you make it through the initial ordeal. The result of this limited medical care was a reality of high mortality. Even common illnesses that we now cure with a simple antibiotic, a persistent fever, a severe cut, a bad respiratory infection, could easily lead to death. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and infant. Infectious diseases, as we've explored with limited hygiene, spread unchecked and claimed lives rapidly. You'd witness constant sickness and death around you, a grim reminder of your own vulnerability. Regardless of your intellectual prowess, life as an ancient Greek philosopher, for all its mental stimulation, offered remarkably little protection against the ravages of disease and injury. Your body was constantly at risk, and your chances of recovery, should you fall ill, were terrifyingly slim. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this limited medical care is the foundational works of Hippocrates and his school, which, despite their groundbreaking emphasis on observation and ethics, still operated without knowledge of microbiology, antiseptic practices, or modern surgical techniques, limiting the efficacy of their treatments compared to today. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some ancient Greek physicians occasionally employed dream incubation, sleeping in sacred temples, often of Asclepius, the god of medicine, in hopes that the gods would reveal a cure in their dreams, essentially turning medical diagnosis into a divine lottery. Imagine your doctor telling you to go to sleep in a temple and hope for a divine vision to cure your migraine. It certainly added a spiritual dimension to healthcare, if not a very scientific one. Historians still argue whether the practical knowledge and observation skills of ancient Greek physicians primarily led to incremental improvements in public health and a rudimentary understanding of the body, or if their theoretical frameworks like humoral theory and lack of germ theory ultimately hindered genuine medical progress for centuries. Perpetuating harmful practices, did it help or hinder regardless? Your physical well-being as an ancient Greek philosopher was constantly imperiled by limited medical care, marked by primitive treatments, and shadowed by the grim reality of high mortality, making every ailment a serious gamble. So, your physical well-being as an ancient Greek philosopher was constantly imperiled by limited medical care, marked by primitive treatments, and shadowed by the grim reality of high mortality, making every ailment a serious gamble. But even if you miraculously escaped physical harm, your intellectual life was often fraught with another kind of danger threat of political exile ostracism. Ban, loss of home. Forget academic freedom and tenure in ancient Greece. Speaking truth to power or simply becoming too influential could lead to forced displacement, stripping you of your community and your very identity. Imagine diligently developing a new philosophical school of thought, gaining a loyal following of students, and perhaps even offering advice to powerful politicians. Now imagine that your growing influence, or a controversial idea you espoused, makes you a target in ancient Athens. The infamous practice of ostracism could be wielded against prominent citizens. This wasn't a punishment for a crime, but a vote by the assembly to ban any individual deemed a threat to the stability of the state or simply too powerful. Imagine being exiled for 10 years, not because you committed a crime, but because you were just a bit too popular or your ideas were a little too provocative. It's like being canceled, but instead of losing your social media account, you lose your entire country, beyond formal ostracism. A direct threat of political exile could arise from political enemies or shifts in power. If your philosophical ideas were perceived as undermining the prevailing political system, or if you were too closely associated with a disgraced leader, you could be driven from the city, often with little warning. Imagine having to flee your home, leaving behind your library of scrolls if you had one, your students, and your entire way of life, simply because your thoughts had ruffled the wrong feathers. It's enough to make you consider a career in something less controversial, like basket weaving. This loss of home was incredibly devastating for an ancient Greek. Your identity was deeply tied to your polis city-state. To be exiled meant losing your citizenship, your property which might be confiscated, your social standing, and your intellectual community. You would become a wanderer, dependent on the goodwill of strangers in foreign lands, often unable to return for years, if ever. Imagine suddenly becoming a stateless person, stripped of everything familiar, simply for pursuing wisdom. Philosophers, by their very nature, challenged conventions and questioned authority. This made them particularly susceptible to this kind of political persecution. Socrates was famously condemned to death, but many others faced exile as a lesser, though still devastating, punishment. Plato himself faced political difficulties and briefly became involved in Sicilian politics. Leading to his return to Athens, this constant political vulnerability added a significant layer of risk to the philosopher's life, turning intellectual pursuit into a potentially dangerous gamble where the price of truth could be everything you knew and loved. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this threat is the recorded instances of prominent figures, including statesmen and thinkers, being ostracized from Athens, such as Aristides, Themistocles, and Thucydides, confirming the real political danger for influential individuals. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that the pottery shards ostraca, on which Athenian citizens would write the name of the person they wished to ostracize, have been found in large numbers, sometimes with names misspelled, suggesting even illiterates could participate in the banishment vote. Imagine getting kicked out of your country because someone spelled your name wrong on a ballot. It's a rather arbitrary, yet terribly effective form of ancient political get-out. Historians still argue whether the practice of ostracism in ancient Athens primarily served as a crucial democratic mechanism to prevent tyranny and maintain civic harmony by removing overmighty individuals, or if it was often exploited as a tool for political vengeance and factionalism, leading to the unjust banishment of innocent citizens. Did it protect democracy, or just fuel grudges regardless? Your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was perpetually shadowed by the threat of political exile, where a formal ostracism or an informal ban could mean the devastating loss of home, simply for daring to think or speak too freely. So, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was perpetually shadowed by the threat of political exile, where a formal ostracism or an informal ban could mean the devastating loss of home, simply for daring to think or speak too freely. But even if you avoided political persecution, you would often find yourself facing a different, more pervasive challenge in your daily interactions: societal misunderstanding, mockery, accusation, public ridicule. Forget universal acclaim and revered status. Ancient Greek philosophers were frequently viewed with suspicion, derision, and outright hostility by a populace that often preferred practical action to abstract thought. Imagine attempting to explain your complex theories on virtue or the nature of justice to the average Athenian citizen. You wouldn't always be met with eager minds and respectful silence. Instead, you'd often encounter societal misunderstanding. Most people were concerned with the practicalities of daily life: farming, trade, military service, civic duties. Abstract philosophical discussions could seem utterly irrelevant, confusing, or even dangerous. It's like trying to explain quantum physics to someone who just wants to know why their donkey isn't moving. This misunderstanding frequently devolved into outright mockery. Playwrights, particularly comedic ones like Aristophanes, lampooned philosophers mercilessly in their works, portraying them as absent-minded, impractical, financially inept, or even subversive. Socrates, for instance, was famously caricatured in Aristophanes' play The Clouds, depicted as a ridiculous figure who taught students how to win unjust arguments and floated around in a basket. Imagine being the subject of a popular play where you're made out to be a total fool in front of thousands of your fellow citizens. It's enough to make you consider changing careers to something with less public exposure, like competitive pebble counting. Beyond mockery, philosophers could face serious accusation: their questioning of traditional beliefs, their rational inquiries into the nature of the gods, or their unconventional lifestyles could be perceived as impiety or corrupting influences on the youth. This wasn't just idle chatter; it could lead to formal charges, as it did for Anaxagoras, Protagoras, and famously, Socrates. Imagine being dragged before a jury of your peers, accused of disrespecting the gods simply because you dared to think critically about the universe. The result was frequent public ridicule, whether in the agora, at the gymnasium, or even in casual conversation. Philosophers might be the target of jokes, insults, or general disdain. Their eccentricities, real or imagined, would be magnified and used against them. Imagine trying to maintain your intellectual dignity while people point and laugh at your threadbare cloak or your peculiar habit of staring into space. This constant pushback from a society that often didn't quite get them made the philosopher's path a challenging and often lonely one. Requiring immense resilience and conviction to pursue their intellectual mission, despite the prevailing skepticism and scorn. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this societal misunderstanding is the direct portrayal of philosophers as figures of fun and suspicion in ancient Greek comedies. Especially Aristophanes' The Clouds, which serves as primary evidence of widespread public lampooning of intellectual figures. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers, in response to the mockery, would reportedly use self-deprecating humor or even exaggerate their own eccentricities, turning the public's ridicule into a philosophical statement about societal absurdity. Imagine Plato trying to deflect a joke about his sandals by making an even funnier one about his own feet. It's certainly a creative way to deal with public humiliation. Historians still argue whether the societal misunderstanding and ridicule faced by ancient Greek philosophers primarily served as a healthy check on intellectual arrogance and prevented detachment from practical life, or if it ultimately stifled profound philosophical inquiry and discouraged genuine intellectual dissent by making it socially dangerous. Did it keep them grounded, or just marginalize them? Regardless, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was often a struggle against societal misunderstanding, enduring relentless mockery, facing baseless accusation, and suffering continuous public ridicule from a world that wasn't always ready for your profound thoughts. So, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was often a struggle against societal misunderstanding, enduring relentless mockery, facing baseless accusation, and suffering continuous public ridicule from a world that wasn't always ready for your profound thoughts. But even as you navigated the daily social and intellectual challenges, a far more visceral threat could shatter your world at any moment: danger of warfare, military service, siege, invasion. Forget being exempt from conflict due to your intellectual pursuits. Ancient Greece was a turbulent landscape, and even philosophers were citizens first, subject to the brutal realities of constant conflict. Imagine spending your days contemplating ethics and metaphysics, only for the drums of war to suddenly beat. Ancient Greek city-states were frequently at odds with each other, leading to endemic conflict. As a male citizen, you were expected to perform military service. This wasn't an optional activity for the learned, it was a civic duty. Socrates, famously, served as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman in several campaigns, distinguishing himself with his courage. Imagine exchanging your philosophical scrolls for a heavy shield and a spear, marching off to battle alongside farmers and craftsmen, knowing that death was a very real possibility. It's like being drafted into the army, but your main weapon is the Socratic method, which, let's be honest, probably won't stop a charging Persian. The danger of warfare permeated daily life. Battles were often brutal, hand-to-hand engagements, with high casualty rates, even if you survived a pitched battle. The aftermath could be grim, with long marches, inadequate supplies, and the constant threat of disease. Imagine seeing your philosophical colleagues fall around you, or returning home with injuries that would receive primitive medical care. Remember those dubious treatments. Beyond open battle, your city-state could face a siege if an enemy army invested your city. Life within the walls would become increasingly desperate. Food and water supplies would dwindle, disease would spread, and the constant threat of a breach in the walls would loom. Imagine your philosophical discussions being interrupted by the sounds of enemy battering rams, or watching your fellow citizens starve as the days drag on under siege. It's enough to make you reconsider the virtues of civic engagement. And in the worst-case scenario, there was the terror of an invasion. If your city fell, the consequences could be catastrophic, widespread slaughter, enslavement of the population, and the destruction of your home and institutions. Philosophers, like all citizens, face the very real prospect of losing everything to a conquering force. Imagine your beloved academy being burned to the ground, and your students scattered or enslaved, all because of the fortunes of war. This constant threat meant that intellectual pursuits often had to take a back seat to the grim necessities of survival. Even philosophers, who sought wisdom, understood that without a secure polis, there was no context for their work. Their lives were intimately intertwined with the brutal geopolitics of their time. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this danger is the documented participation of many prominent Greek philosophers and intellectuals in military campaigns, such as Socrates at the battles of Paideia, Delium, and Amphipolis, directly confirming that their civic duties included active combat. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers would reportedly engage in intense physical training at the gymnasia, not just for intellectual discourse, but to maintain the physical conditioning necessary for hoplite warfare, turning their philosophical hangout into a kind of ancient boot camp. Imagine Plato explaining the perfect form of a squat while simultaneously preparing for a battle. It certainly gave a new meaning to mind-body connection. Historians still argue whether the constant threat of warfare in ancient Greece primarily stimulated intellectual thought by forcing reflection on ethics, governance, and the nature of courage, or if it perpetually disrupted scholarly pursuits, caused widespread suffering, and diverted resources that could have been used for intellectual advancement. Did it sharpen their minds? Or just cut short their lives regardless? Your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was never purely academic, constantly overshadowed by the danger of warfare, requiring mandatory military service, and exposing you to the terrifying realities of siege and invasion. So, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was never purely academic, constantly overshadowed by the danger of warfare, requiring mandatory military service, and exposing you to the terrifying realities of siege and invasion. But even if you survived the battlefield and avoided exile, another peculiar frustration would likely plague your intellectual endeavors: no copyright or income ideas stolen. Lack of royalties. Forget intellectual property rights or lucrative book deals in the ancient world. Your brilliant thoughts and eloquent lectures were freely disseminated, offering little direct financial reward or protection. Imagine spending years developing a groundbreaking philosophical system, carefully crafting arguments, and articulating profound insights. Now imagine that anyone could simply write down your lectures, attribute them to themselves, and disseminate them widely, and you'd have absolutely no legal recourse. This was the reality of no copyright in ancient Greece. The concept of intellectual property as we understand it simply didn't exist. Your ideas, once spoken, belong to the public domain. It's like living in a world where every single YouTube video you upload is immediately, legally, stolen and re-uploaded by dozens of other channels. And you can't do a thing about it. This meant that your intellectual output rarely translated into direct income. While some philosophers might receive gifts from wealthy patrons or fees from students, though many, like Socrates, famously rejected payment, there was no system for earning royalties from your written works, even if you painstakingly wrote a treatise. Anyone could copy it, sell it, and profit from it. While you received nothing, imagine dedicating your life to writing profound philosophical dialogues, only for someone else to make all the money from their distribution. It's enough to make you consider a career in something with more immediate financial returns, like being a mercenary. The very nature of oral culture, prevalent at the time, also contributed to ideas being freely shared and often attributed or reinterpreted without direct permission. While this fostered intellectual exchange, it also meant that your unique contribution could easily be diluted or, worse, completely appropriated. Your ideas could be stolen or misrepresented, and you'd have little control over their interpretation once they left your lips or hands. Imagine passionately explaining your intricate philosophical framework, only to later hear someone else confidently presenting it as their own at another gathering, slightly mangled. This economic reality meant that philosophers often struggled financially. Despite their intellectual genius, their pursuit of wisdom was rarely a path to wealth. Creating a stark contrast between their lofty minds and their often meager material circumstances, it emphasized that philosophy was a way of life, not a profession in the modern sense. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this lack of intellectual property is the absence of any legal framework or concept similar to copyright in ancient Greece, leading to the widespread copying and dissemination of texts without payment to the original author, which is evident in how ancient works were transmitted and sold. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some ancient philosophical schools, in an effort to protect their unique teachings and prevent misattribution, would reportedly keep certain doctrines secret or esoteric, only revealing them to inner circles of trusted students after years of study, essentially creating their own primitive form of intellectual property control Imagine having a secret handshake and password just for your philosophy club to make sure no one steals your cool ideas. It's a rather secretive way to protect your intellectual brand. Historians still argue whether the absence of copyright and financial incentives for intellectual work in ancient Greece primarily fostered a more collaborative and communal intellectual environment, leading to a richer exchange of ideas. Or if it limited the ability of philosophers to dedicate themselves fully to their work, forcing them into financial hardship or reliance on potentially stifling patronage. Did it promote sharing? Or just poverty regardless? Your brilliant mind as an ancient Greek philosopher would be constantly frustrated by the reality of no copyright or income, where your hard-won ideas could be easily stolen, and you'd face a perpetual lack of royalties for your profound contributions to human thought. So, your brilliant mind as an ancient Greek philosopher would be constantly frustrated by the reality of no copyright or income, where your hard-won ideas could be easily stolen, and you'd face a perpetual lack of royalties for your profound contributions to human thought. But even more pressing than the lack of financial return for your intellectual property was the far more immediate and often uncomfortable reality of your daily support system. Reliance on students' disciples begging, dependence, annoyance. Forget institutional funding or professional salaries. Many philosophers depended entirely on the goodwill, generosity, and sometimes sheer tolerance of their followers, creating a complex and often strained dynamic. Imagine trying to live a life devoted to contemplation and teaching, but without a steady income. Many ancient Greek philosophers found themselves in a state of reliance on students, disciples. These students, often young men from affluent families, would gather around a respected philosopher to learn from them. While some might pay a fee, others, especially if the philosopher rejected payment, would contribute through gifts, food, or by simply supporting their teacher's basic needs. It's like being a permanent, very demanding house guest for a rotating cast of slightly awkward teenagers, all of whom expect you to be brilliant 24/7. This dependence often bordered on begging. Philosophers like Diogenes or even Socrates, who disdained material wealth, might find themselves in situations where they openly asked for sustenance, or simply allowed their followers to provide for them. Imagine having to rely on the charity of your students for your next meal or a new tunic. It's certainly a humbling experience for someone dedicated to intellectual superiority. It's enough to make you consider starting a Patreon, even if you don't know what Patreon is. This dynamic naturally led to a state of dependence. Your ability to continue teaching, to have a roof over your head, and to eat regularly, often hinged on the continued willingness of your disciples to support you. If your ideas fell out of favor, or your students moved on, you could quickly find yourself without basic necessities. Imagine living with the constant anxiety that your philosophical appeal directly translated into your ability to survive. And let's not forget the annoyance factor. While some students were brilliant and dedicated, others might be slow learners, overly inquisitive, argumentative, or simply irritating. You'd be spending nearly all your waking hours with these individuals, not just teaching them, but often relying on them. Imagine trying to explain a complex philosophical concept for the 10th time to a student who just isn't getting it, all while knowing that your dinner tonight depends on their continued attendance. The patience required must have been truly Herculean. This intimate, often demanding, relationship with their students highlights the unique economic and social structure that supported philosophical inquiry in ancient Greece. Far removed from modern academic institutions, one mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this reliance on students is the historical accounts of philosophical schools forming around charismatic figures, e.g., Plato's Academy, Aristotle's Lyceum, where students lived and studied in close proximity to their teachers, often contributing to their upkeep. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers, when their students became particularly annoying or questioned them too much, would reportedly dismiss them with sarcastic remarks or elaborate logical puzzles, hoping to either silence them or send them away. Imagine trying to get your philosophy professor to stop talking, and he just gives you a riddle that makes your head hurt for a week. It was certainly a unique form of office hours. Historians still argue whether the reliance of ancient Greek philosophers on their students primarily fostered a deep, personal connection and mentorship that was crucial for intellectual transmission, or if it created an unhealthy power dynamic and limited the independence of thought for both teachers and students. Did it create genius, or just sycophancy regardless? Your daily life as an ancient Greek philosopher was often a precarious tightrope walk, defined by your reliance on students' disciples, sometimes bordering on begging, always fostering dependence, and frequently testing your patience with their sheer annoyance. So your daily life as an ancient Greek philosopher was often a precarious tightrope walk, defined by your reliance on students' disciples, sometimes bordering on begging, always fostering dependence, and frequently testing your patience with their sheer annoyance. But even if you manage to navigate these human complexities, another fundamental hardship of the ancient world would constantly challenge your ability to share your ideas or seek new knowledge. Primitive travel long journeys, robbery, harsh conditions. Forget comfortable planes or even well-maintained roads. Ancient Greek travel was an arduous, dangerous, and physically punishing endeavor, making every journey a significant undertaking. Imagine needing to visit another city-state to attend a philosophical gathering, consult with a colleague, or escape political pressure. You wouldn't simply book a ticket. Your only options were by land or by sea, both fraught with peril and discomfort, making primitive travel a defining feature of your broader intellectual life. It's like planning a cross-country trip, but every single mile is an extreme sport, and there are no rest stops with decent coffee. If you traveled by land, you'd be walking, often for days or weeks, or perhaps riding a donkey if you were lucky. Roads were often unpaved, dusty in summer and muddy in winter, filled with ruts and stones. There were no comfortable inns every few miles. You'd often have to sleep outdoors or in very basic shelters. Imagine trudging mile after mile under the hot Greek sun, your feet aching, your simple sandals offering little protection. Carrying your few possessions on your back. It's enough to make you long for a simple pair of sneakers and a bus pass. The threat of robbery was constant. Banditry was rife, especially in isolated mountain passes or along less traveled routes. Travelers, even philosophers, were prime targets for brigands who would strip them of their few coins, food, or valuable scrolls. Imagine rounding a bend on a desolate road only to be confronted by armed men demanding your meager possessions. This forced travelers to often journey in groups for safety, adding to the logistical challenges. And then there were the harsh conditions of sea travel. While faster, sailing in the ancient world was at the mercy of the winds and currents. Ships were small, often open to the elements, and lacked any real amenities. Storms could arise suddenly, sinking vessels without warning. Piracy was a persistent menace. Imagine spending days or weeks crammed onto a small, smelly ship, constantly seasick, exposed to the elements, and living in fear of a sudden storm or a pirate raid. It's certainly a humbling experience for someone used to intellectual high ground. This combination of slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous journeys meant that geographical isolation was a very real barrier to the exchange of ideas. Every journey was an adventure, but one filled with genuine peril and physical strain, turning intellectual networking into an endurance test. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this primitive travel is the numerous detailed accounts in ancient Greek literature, e.g. historical works by Herodotus and Thucydides, or the travel writings of Pausanias describing long, arduous overland journeys and dangerous sea voyages, confirming the challenges faced by travelers. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers, particularly those known for their asceticism, would reportedly refuse to use any form of transport, insisting on walking everywhere, even across vast distances. As a philosophical statement about self-sufficiency and detachment from material comforts, effectively turning every trip into an extreme pilgrimage. Imagine your philosophy professor insisting on walking from New York to California for a conference. Just to prove a point, it's certainly a dedicated, if somewhat inconvenient, way to travel. Historians still argue whether the primitive and dangerous nature of ancient Greek travel primarily fostered a strong sense of local identity and unique philosophical schools within each city-state, due to limited intercity exchange, or if it significantly hindered the rapid dissemination of knowledge and the broader intellectual development across the Hellenic world. Did it create unique cultures, or just slow down progress regardless? Your attempts to expand your mind as an ancient Greek philosopher were perpetually limited by the reality of primitive travel, demanding long journeys fraught with the danger of robbery and endured under relentlessly harsh conditions. So, your attempts to expand your mind as an ancient Greek philosopher were perpetually limited by the reality of primitive travel, demanding long journeys fraught with the danger of robbery and endured under relentlessly harsh conditions. But perhaps the most profound and ethically challenging aspect of ancient Greek life that truly defined the philosopher's existence, even as they contemplated justice and freedom, was the pervasive presence of slavery as a norm moral dilemma. Daily reality. Forget abolitionist movements or concepts of universal human rights. The very fabric of ancient Greek society, including the philosophical schools, was built upon the exploitation of enslaved people, forcing philosophers to confront, or often rationalize, a fundamental contradiction. Imagine living in a world where a significant portion of the population was considered property, bought and sold like livestock. This was the daily reality of slavery as a norm in ancient Greece. Whether you were a wealthy citizen or a struggling philosopher, you would interact with enslaved people constantly. They worked in homes, fields, mines, workshops, and even as tutors or scribes. Your philosophical debates in the agora were likely swept by enslaved hands. Your meager meals were probably prepared and served by them. It's like living in a society where a third of the population is simply not considered people, and their labor underpins everything, including your ability to sit around and think. For philosophers, this presented an immense moral dilemma. How could you, as a seeker of truth and justice, reconcile your ideals of freedom, reason, and human flourishing with the brutal reality of human bondage? Some philosophers, like Aristotle, attempted to rationalize slavery, arguing that some individuals were slaves by nature and suited for servitude. Others, like the Stoics, began to question the concept, arguing for an inner freedom of the mind regardless of one's external status. But very few, if any, actively campaigned for abolition in the modern sense. Imagine spending your days dissecting concepts of liberty and equality, then returning home to enslaved individuals who have no liberty or equality. It's enough to make you feel like a hypocrite, or at least a very uncomfortable dinner guest at your own home. The sheer normalcy of slavery meant that even the most insightful minds often failed to see it as an inherent injustice. It was simply the way things were. The philosophers' ability to dedicate themselves to abstract thought, to engage in leisure and civic life, was often directly facilitated by the labor of enslaved individuals. They cleaned their homes, cooked their food, carried their scrolls, and performed countless other tasks that freed up the philosopher's time for contemplation. Imagine your entire intellectual pursuit being enabled by someone else's forced labor. It profoundly complicates the legacy of their free thought. This pervasive reliance on slave labor was a silent, yet powerful, component of the ancient Greek philosophical life, shaping not only their economic reality but also subtly influencing their ethical theories and the very definition of the good life. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this pervasive presence is the estimated demographics of ancient Greek city-states, where enslaved populations often constituted a significant percentage, sometimes one-third or more of the total inhabitants in places like Athens. Indicating slavery's integral role in the economy and society, A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is that some philosophers who advocated extreme asceticism, like Diogenes the Cynic, would reportedly choose to live without slaves, even if they could afford them, as a radical statement of self-sufficiency and rejection of societal norms, making their stance on slavery one of personal renunciation rather than active liberation. Imagine a philosopher saying, "I'm so committed to my principles, I'll even wash my own dishes." It was a rather dramatic, if limited, form of protest. Historians still argue whether the presence of widespread slavery in ancient Greece primarily allowed for the leisure and intellectual freedom necessary for the development of philosophy and democracy, by freeing citizens from manual labor, or if it fundamentally contradicted the very ideals of freedom and reason espoused by the philosophers themselves, thereby limiting the scope and impact of their ethical thought. Did it enable philosophy, or just undermine its moral authority? Regardless, your life as an ancient Greek philosopher was inescapably intertwined with slavery as a norm, forcing you into a constant moral dilemma while it remained a harsh and undeniable daily reality. Now, let the echoes of ancient debates fade, the dust of the agora settle, and the scent of olive oil and unwashed bodies gently dissipate. The hard stone benches soften, the flickering oil lamps dim, and the nagging worries about food and hygiene vanish into a blurring memory. There's no more fear of public ridicule, no more concern about an empty stomach, and no more wrestling with complex moral contradictions. Just the quiet hum of your fan, the soft comfort of your bed, and the profound stillness of the night. You can release the imagined burdens of that harsh philosophical life, the discomfort, the constant scrutiny, and the challenging realities of a world so different from our own. That gritty, often uncomfortable, but utterly fascinating world of ancient thinkers belongs to history, not to your peaceful present. Drift now into a deep, untroubled rest. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams?